the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous languor.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
Welcome to Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight, the show where we speak to those on the front lines of defending democracy around the world. New episodes drop every Friday, and if you enjoy this program, then I do have one favor to ask of you. If you can think of just one other person who you think may enjoy it as well, may find value in it, a friend, colleague, or family member, then share it with them and tell them why you like it. With your help, we can help get these vital stories out to more and more people. Also, don't forget to check out the rest of my work on the Dictators v Democrats YouTube and Substack channels. If you want to support my work, then paid subscribers to Substack and Patreon get access to Why We Fight 1 week early. With all of that said, let's find out why they fight. Welcome to this very special episode of Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. I am very excited for this one. I am joined today by a man who has been at the forefront of international relations for decades. Former head of the CIA, led ISAF, was heavily involved in US foreign policy as a military leader and as an intelligence official, General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you, thanks.
General, you've spent your life in service. What first drew you to public service and what values shaped that decision?
Well, I think a lot of what you do in life is because you want to be like someone you admire. In the US, there's that phrase, be like, I think it heard Michael Jordan. For me, Michael Jordan was cadets at West Point, products of West Point. You have to understand that I grew up 7 miles from West Point. At least half of the customers on my morning newspaper route were graduates of West Point, staff and faculty at West Point, former professors at West Point, you name it. And I had great admiration for them. There was a very big presence in our community, including in our schools. I think there were at least 2 former U.S. Military Academy professors with PhDs who, after they retired from a full several decades in the military and had been living in our community, I guess, chose to stay there and then became teachers at the high school. Our high school soccer coach was a retired full colonel. He did the job for $1 a year. He had actually been a coach of a West Point team that had won the national championship, I think back in the war years or something when other colleges perhaps had to shut down. And we won the championship our senior year. So again, there were all these points of intersection. Many of our athletic championships ultimately would be played on fields actually at West Point. Our home ski slope, I was on the ski team, was also West Point, et cetera, et cetera. So in many respects, it was somewhat natural. I should note that my father, who was a former Dutch sea captain who came to the United States at the outbreak of World War II when they couldn't go home when the Nazis overran Holland and they were at sea, would have preferred that I go to the Naval Academy. My mother would have wanted me to go to some place that was a bit more sensitive or something like that, or had greater emphasis on literary studies or who knows what. But at the end of the day, we drove 7 miles around Storm King Mountain, and I showed up on July 1st of 1970.
You've had an enormously varied career, reaching the very pinnacle. And when you look back across it, when did you most clearly see democratic values under threat?
Oh, I saw them under threat all the time. Keep in mind that, of course, the first, let's see, first 15 years or so, it was a Cold War. I actually served with a battalion, then a brigade that was near the inter-German border. I was the speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander. In fact, the year that the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement was done with the Soviet Union, we studied Soviet vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery. We memorized what they looked like. We memorized their military doctrine, their structure, all of this. And so, again, from the very beginning, I saw, if you will, democratic values that they did not exist certainly not in the Soviet Union itself. There were some soft forms of some kind of yearnings, at least for democracy, in some of the countries of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. And of course, that was ultimately, those pressures ultimately contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union, as did a number of other factors, not the least of which was a command economy that just could not compete with free market economies, and just the breakdown of the overall state in a way that almost, I think, Orwell would have predicted, and did predict to some degree, particularly in Animal House.
And during your time as director of the CIA, you had perhaps one of the best views from a person operating in the democratic world of how authoritarian regimes operate from the inside. And what did that experience teach you about how they use influence, coercion, control, and propaganda? And how should democracies respond to this?
Well, again, that was a wonderful vantage point for looking at what were often actual adversaries or potential adversaries. And again, many of which had some features of the old Soviet Union. But again, we had studied the old Soviet Union intently. This was the absolute focus in the post-Vietnam era. The shift was entirely to the standoff between the US-led NATO and the USSR-led Warsaw Pact. And again, that was the absolute focus of the US military in the wake of Vietnam. In fact, it was a turning away from what Vietnam had been. In fact, we never wanted to do a counterinsurgency operation again. Not that we actually got the strategy right for that until about 13 years into that tragic experience. But now we're doing something, of course, that not only was it the most important standoff in the world, and where we needed absolutely to deter conflict, but it was also something that was much more comfortable for the U.S. Army. This is what we wanted to do, as sort of the big war. This is why Desert Shield and Desert Storm were sent from central casting for the U.S. military. It's hard to believe Saddam Hussein could have done a more foolish thing than actually fight the U.S. military in a setting that was almost like that at which we train at the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert. Again, tank on tank, open, again, terrain, very little. There was certainly fighting among the people inside Kuwait City and so forth. But again, by and large, this is what we trained to do and did it magnificently there. Every weapon system, including now the precision munitions from the air and the rest of that, were all employed in that regard. And again, in a way, that's the way we saw what could happen in a NATO Warsaw Pact fight, and therefore convince us even more, obviously, that we needed to prevent it by having the elements of deterrence being very solid. And of course, those are the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. And those are still very applicable today, especially when we look, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. But again, during that time, we studied intently the nature of the Soviet regime, the nature of some of the Eastern European country regimes. There was a subject then that actually then died away. So when I was going to graduate school, for example, there were still courses on comparative politics. And of course, the systems that were compared were largely the various versions of the theme of democratically elected leaders and free market economics. And of course, there are different, again, some emphasize a bit more state intervention in here or there, higher taxes or lower taxes, or parliamentary versus our kind of system, and so on. But again, all variations on that theme versus, of course, the command economy approach of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party government that was practiced there, and again, in most of the Eastern European countries. So we'd pretty much studied up on this, I think, very considerably. And even after their demise, there were still many of these kinds of systems, but of various types. If you think of some of the systems in the greater Middle East, for example, I mean, you look at Syria, which had considerable elements of free market economics, but also lots of intrusion by the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime. And before that, of course, the regime of his father. And certainly no democratic elections, or if they are, they were some kind of fiction, as you see, for example, in the Russian Federation today. And then you see a variety of others, again, where you have a single party running a country, but some degree of market competition based on their characteristics, or however you want to refer to it. So again, I think you have to be very, very careful not to try to define too precisely what it is, but they all share features. And I think if you read the brilliant writing, for example, of Anne Applebaum, who is, of course, interestingly, the wife of Radek Sikorski, who's back in government in Poland now as the foreign minister, someone we've all known well. He was the Minister of Defense in the past and well admire. If you read what she has written, I think it is the clearest and most articulate description of how authoritarians gain power, how they try to take over the other elements of government that could interfere with their exercise of power. So the judicial component of government to intimidate the press or buy it up or what have you, how to co-opt a parliament and so on. So again, I think there's plenty of tremendous literature out there. I would single hers out for being particularly important and particularly descriptive and full of insight. But again, there is no shortage of scholarship in that particular field, even if the study of comparative politics has somewhat gone by the by. And I'd add, of course, that we thought that these alternative systems had died, had collapsed of the weight of the command economy and the Communist Party rule in the Soviet Union, and there was an end of history, as was proclaimed, of course, in that famous article in The National Interest by Frank Fukuyama. But as it turned out, and as he actually ultimately acknowledged, history's back with a vengeance. And there are competitors for the best system, if you will. He, of course, had essentially, the brilliance of his article, obviously, was that he predicted the demise, the collapse of the Soviet Union about 6 months before it collapsed. And as you'll recall, that was not something necessarily expected to happen by the intelligence assessments at that time as quickly as it did. And there are a number of factors that led to that. But again, he, in a way, idealized the democratic free market economies of the world and said that's it's the highest attainment of mankind. It has prevailed. All the others have been disproven. And obviously that proved to be a bit premature because we see a number of autocratic leaders around the world, various levels of, again, autocracy, including at least one, of course, that is in the European Union in the form of Hungary. And in that case, the leader has done exactly what Anne Applebaum describes, which is, again, co-opting the parliament, getting them in his grip, essentially controlling the press in many cases. In that particular situation, his wealthy buddies buy the elements of the press that are writing unfavorable stories about him and his government. And then also, of course, co-opting the judicial system. I should note here, it's very interesting, of course, that that's not coincidental with the fact that Hungary has the worst performing economy in the European Union, I believe. And it didn't have to be that way. And it could be that that is what brings about the demise of his leadership and his government.
I was in Budapest earlier in the year, and you can see the decline. Compared to Kyiv, a city which is regularly bombed, Budapest somehow looks more tired around the edges.
Absolutely.
And when you're looking at the global landscape today, the messes that we find ourselves in, what concerns you the most, both strategically, but also looking at ourselves and in what, strategically from our rivals and from ourselves ethically?
So first of all, it's kind of you to note that I've spent my life in government service. Actually, I haven't. I spent nearly 40 years actually more than 40 years in uniform, if you count the 4 years at West Point, and then as the director of the CIA. But so some 4 decades in government service. But for over 12 years now, I've actually been the chairman of the Global Institute of one of the largest and I would say most impressive investment firms in the world, KKR. And I've been a partner there for well over a decade as well. I'm also now the chairman of KKR Middle East as of a few months back. We do the geopolitical risk assessment during the diligence process. On some occasions, I think it's 5 or 6, we have actually said we should not do this deal, and we have not, even though a deal team might have wanted to proceed with it and will have spent a fair amount of time and money doing diligence. We also then help our companies. We own roughly 130 companies at any given time. Some of those own over 100 companies themselves as well. Minority investments, another 130 or so. And when they run into trouble, my team and I can go out together with our leaders and others in the local and regional deal teams and so forth and try to rectify those situations. And we've got a really good track record in that. Over 60 times we've been able to resolve issues that otherwise would have prevented a successful outcome for a deal. And then we spend a lot of time with our investors. So we look at the world constantly. And by the way, there have to be certain conditions for us to invest. And they include functioning, honest government, governance, a functioning judicial system, and the like. And if you don't have that, you don't do major investments. I'm not saying that you can't invest in lots of places that have lots of challenges. There are plenty of places, if you're doing small investments, I'd be more than happy to take the risk in various African countries, but there are few, if any, that have the qualities, attributes, and so forth that we look for when you're going to make really big deals. And that's the business that we're in. When you look at the world strategically, I think inevitably you come back to the most important relationship in the world today, which is that between China and the US and our Western allies and partners. That is the one that we have to get right. We obviously recognize that this is a very competitive relationship. In fact, our former National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, used to refer to this as severe competition. And I think that captures it. That doesn't mean that you can decouple. It means that you should de-risk. But you cannot decouple. We're highly dependent on China for a whole host of imports. And they're actually highly dependent on us to feed their people and their livestock. So there is a mutual relationship here that is going to continue. It has to continue, even as there is this competition that's being played out, and even as there are increasing restrictions on what we can invest in China, what we can sell to China, what China can invest in here, et cetera, et cetera. again, that is, if you think of the United States and our allies and partners together as the guys in the circus who keep a lot of different plates spinning, and the plates represent challenges and issues with which we have to contend. And I would contend that there are more plates in that tent, more challenges, more issues than absolutely at any time since the end of the Cold War, and maybe even all the way back to the end of World War II. But in that tent, and again, allies and partners help us keep some of those plates spinning. The plate that represents the relationship between the U.S. and the West and China is bigger than all the other plates. So to capture the importance of that particular relationship, that doesn't mean there aren't lots of other challenges. Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine, North Korea and its continued nuclear program, Iran and its malicious actions around the Middle East, despite it being hammered and losing, seeing its most important proxy, Hezbollah, dramatically degraded and hopefully soon to be disarmed, losing its friend and ally in Syria with the overthrow of the murderous Bashar al-Assad and his regime, watching as others of their proxies, Hamas, have been dramatically degraded, although obviously still a lot of work to be done there and not necessarily the right strategy. But again, many, many other challenges, cyber threats, criminal actors, narco-trafficantes, all of these others that you could list, even including those resulting from changes in the climate, weather patterns, much more severe storms, more severe fires, and so forth. But again, the most important has to do with, again, the U.S. and China. That's one where we have to ensure that the elements of deterrence, as I described them earlier, capabilities on the one hand, their perception of your capabilities, their perception of you're willing to use them, has to be absolutely solid without ever being needlessly provocative. There is no need for that, and it could be counterproductive. When it comes to ourselves, well, you can look around the world and see where there are challenges to democracy of a variety of different types, and challenges to the system, again, of free market capitalist economies, global trade, all the rest of this. There's no end of challenges, including some that are obviously present in the United States and also present as a result of the United States in some of our dealings around the world when it comes to the tariffs and threats of tariffs, some of which are well-founded and some of which a classical economist might raise an eyebrow about. And we'll see what the impact is of those over time. But again, there are plenty of issues out there that we see evolving, including, again, the situation in Hungary, the situation actually that did exist in Poland. The new government, the prime minister in the new government, of course, swept out the old government, which was trying to co-opt the press or intimidate the press, trying to co-opt the judicial system, and so forth. But now you have a situation where you have a president who's elected who is not of the ruling party in the parliament, that will create challenges there. So they're by no means, in a sense, out of the woods when it comes to the kind of issues that Anne Applebaum, who of course spends a fair amount of time in Warsaw, has written about so powerfully and so persuasively.
I'm very happy that you brought up Applebaum. She is my Michael Jordan. Her book Autocracy Inc. is the inspiration for my work, and the reason why I resigned from the police was to pursue this project. And specifically her book Autocracy Inc. Now, this isn't in the list of questions, so I understand if you want to move on from it. The alliance she describes, alliance might be a bit of a strong word, between the autocratic nations, the CRINCs, as people have come to call them, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. How significant is that? How much do we see that at play in Ukraine and in the Indo-Pacific? And
stop right there, because you've asked two questions already, and you normally only get one at a time.
Fair enough.
Let me just start with the first one, which is how significant is it? Well, it's very significant. We have seen Iran provide Shahed drones and other munitions and so forth, although they're much less able to provide that now, given the enormous damage and destruction to not just their nuclear program, but also to their Revolutionary Guards Corps and traditional military capabilities, their abilities to make solid fuel rocket engines, missiles, and on and on. And of course, the fact that their supposedly sophisticated Russian S-300 air and ballistic missile defense system was taken down by the Israelis, actually even before the 12-day air campaign, which also included, of course, very impressive intelligence operations on the ground from Iranian soil. So their initial help was very significant. I think it's fair to assess that what they provided has been now produced by the Russians in their own military industrial system, and those Shahed-like drones now have been enlarged, made more capable, higher flying, more difficult to shoot down, and larger munitions. Look, I do a fair number of trips to Ukraine, about probably every 4 months on average. I think I've been there 6 times since the 2022 invasion. In fact, I was sanctioned by Vladimir Putin in the fall of 2022 for my support for Ukraine. I've many times walked the streets of Kyiv at night, and you hear the buzz of the drones and you paid no notice. I think there is a bit more notice that is being paid because they now can do much more damage than was the case. And it started with Iran, even though Iran is not in a position to continue to provide assistance. North Korea, of course, provided over 1 million heavy artillery munitions and perhaps continues that. There's been less reporting on that. They've provided well over 10,000 soldiers used inside the Russian Federation so far, but they were an important element in pushing the Ukrainian forces out of Kursk province, the one province into which the Ukrainian forces had so impressively and successfully moved and seized quite a bit of territory. I'm sure you also know that the other distinguishing feature of the Korean forces, North Korean forces provided to Russia, is the astonishing amount, apparently, reportedly, astonishing amount of pornography that they have viewed, having never had access to the internet the way that they did in Russia. I guess actually there's another feature, which is that they actually follow their orders and literally will charge to their death if they're told to do that. But again, North Korea has been of assistance to Ukraine. And then you come to China, and China is providing very, very substantial quantities of all of the components that the Russian Federation needs to revive its somewhat moribund military industrial capabilities and complex. And that has been absolutely decisive. It used to be pointed out by the Biden administration, well, China isn't sending weapons systems to them. No, they're not. They're sending the components and all the elements needed to make weapon systems, without which Russia could not produce those weapon systems. In fact, it's well known that Russia was actually buying white goods like refrigerators and then taking the chips and other elements and computers and so forth out of them to use in their military industrial complex. Now they're getting those directly from China. And that is very worrisome and is something that should be addressed by the US-led coalition supporting Ukraine. So you see this. I don't think that China regards Russia as an equal. I don't think this is the kind of relationship that they had back in the days of the Comintern, or when, again, the USSR and the PRC were in their earlier incarnations. But it is a very important relationship, and one with which we have to contend. And then you have the BRICS, which is, again, it's a very unlikely, ungainly combination of countries, some of which have a foot in both worlds, if you will, East and West, and so on. But no, it's a huge concern, and it is a disappointing development that has made life much more difficult for Ukraine and for Ukrainian civilians, because a lot of this has enabled Russia to carry out the missile and drone strikes that have done so much damage to civilian infrastructure in Russia and to civilians, including the Children's Hospital in Ukraine, every single one of the hydroelectric plants, most of the thermal power plants, et cetera. And so this is a major development, even if one component of it, the Iran provision to Russia, has been reduced substantially because of the Israeli and then later the U.S. campaign against them.
And how do we effectively combat this? And how do we do so while maintaining our democratic ideals?
Well, at the heart of foreign policy in a democracy is the imperative of the leadership, the elected leadership, of course, laying out for the population why a country should support another country, why we should ensure that the kind of aggression that Russia has carried out cannot be rewarded, why it's an imperative to ensure that a country like Ukraine, which shares values, principles, the ideals, again, of free market economics, democratically elected leaders, and so on, however flawed. Obviously, there are still oligarchs that have almost monopolistic, or obviously there's a degree of corruption in Ukraine, as there always is in any developing democracy. And there are some autocratic tendencies from time to time, et cetera, et cetera. But by and large, again, that is a country that aspires to be a Western country, which is why, of course, it wants to be part of the EU, not part of the Europe. What is it? The Eurasian Economic Union, I think it is, the EEU of Russia, which has all of, 2 members. I think it's even lost Armenia now, has Belarus and perhaps one other. So again,
Kazakhstan.
Very, very important that we continue to support Ukraine. The other principal argument for doing that is to explain to the people that, again, deterrence in the Indo-Pacific rests on perceptions of our capabilities on the one hand, which we need to transform more rapidly along the lines of what Ukraine has done so impressively with innovation in unmanned systems in particular. And then it also rests on the perception that we will employ our capabilities when necessary to help a friend or what have you. And if you don't do that for Ukraine, then it undermines deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, just as then Prime Minister Lee of Singapore observed to me one time when I was meeting, when it became evident that the red line on Syrian use of chemical weapons by the Obama administration was not a red line. It had been crossed, and we did not do what was anticipated. And he said, that has consequences in the South China Sea. I think also, frankly, that our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way it was conducted sent a message to Putin that we would not be as in substantial support of Ukraine as we were. And I commend the Biden administration for the leadership of the Western world and all that the United States did to support Ukraine, particularly in security assistance, but also financial, economic, humanitarian, and so on, even if we undermine some of that by the excessively long periods of deliberation over every single major weapon system that was provided, whether it was the M1 tank, the multiple launch rocket system, F-16s, the Army tactical missile system, lifting the restrictions on the use of the Army tactical missile system in the Russian Federation, on and on and on, repeatedly. This endless debate and indecisiveness that characterized almost every major U.S. decision on the provision of assistance to Ukraine, which did not help, and I think undermined the overall effort there, and probably led Russia to believe we really had some questions about helping Ukraine, as opposed to being steadfast and absolutely with Ukraine all the way.
I want to talk about values. We touched on them earlier as the reasons why you started your long career in military and later government service.
Well, let me stop. I mean, I was not animated by thoughts of, again, I don't know, democracy and in fact, I've often pointed out that the reason that soldiers fight as they do in tough moments, the reason is not because they feel in the moment that they're actually protecting democracy or the American way of life or keeping the world safe for democracy, this kind of stuff. They're fighting for those who are on their right and left. Certainly out of the fight, it's, again, there is a sense of a mission larger than self, and that is by no means trivial. That is hugely significant, and a sense of privilege of serving with others who feel the same way, especially when their country has been under attack, as was the feeling after the 9/11 attacks. But again, over time, I think is more the commitment to service. And there are other factors as well. If you actually discover that you actually do pretty well at the elements of your profession that are most valued, decent leadership skills, reasonable analytical capabilities, brains, if you will, physical capability, etc. And you enjoy those elements, that's what sort of keeps you in, I think. And then it's also certainly the real sense of, again, this mission larger than self and all those that are serving together in it. So I don't want to say that I went to West Point because of, again, certain values that our country embraced. It was more just a sense of these guys are really impressive. The products of this institution I admire. Maybe I should try to be like them.
Those values now, the ideas, the concepts of democracy, freedom, human rights.
Sure.
What is their value to you now? What do they mean?
Oh, I think it means a great deal. And, as you over time achieve greater responsibility and are at really the top, almost an interface between the political and the military. If you think about when you're commanding a war, exercising truly strategic leadership, you are performing the four functions of a strategic leader. Yes, you got some guidance from Washington, but by and large, they just want you to turn around, pull Iraq out of an ever more violent Sunni Shia civil war. And you decide how to do that. So you've got to get the strategy right, the big ideas right. You have to communicate them effectively. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, and you have to determine how to refine them so you can do it again and again and again. These are the four tasks of a strategic leader. The first and far away most important being crafting the right strategy, getting the big ideas right. And we haven't always done that. It took us, as I mentioned earlier, 13 years to get the big ideas right in Vietnam. It's an incredible tragedy. We failed our soldiers. It took us arguably 8 years in Afghanistan to get the big ideas right, and then another year to get the inputs right to enable the actual execution of the big ideas, just about. And then we only kept those right for 6 months. But you start to, I think, elevate the importance of these kinds of values. Look, when I was in northern Iraq, so we did the fight to Baghdad. I was the commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. We had over 254 helicopters, as well as a conventional infantry, light infantry division's worth of ground forces. So we do the fight to Baghdad. We think that's where we're going to stay because we needed a hard stand at Baghdad International Airport and elsewhere for all the helicopters. And all of a sudden, we're ordered north within 36 hours to secure an area that was out of control, Mosul, city of nearly 2 million people, a melting pot, all the fault lines of the Middle East, in fact, not just Iraq, run through Nainoa province, of which it is the capital. And it was literally in flames. And we air assaulted everything we could in the first lift, rushed into Mosul, quelled it, stunned it, got it all under control and all the rest of that. And then we set about actually trying to establish a provincial government. And the big idea for this, and it would really help that I'd studied very basic concepts of political philosophy and certainly much more heavy duty economics at Princeton in the course of doing the PhD there, and then taught both international relations and economics at Princeton. So we set about trying to establish an interim provincial council. And the big idea was we wanted to the members of it should represent in proportion to the presence in Nainiwa province, but they should represent certainly every district within the province, certainly every tribe, every ethnic group. So keep in mind, we had obviously Arabs and Kurds, we had Yazidis, Shaba, Christians, every sectarian group, Sunni and Shia, as well as the other religions, Turkmen Shia, as well as Turkmen Sunni. You had to really understand the composition of the population. Even the retired generals, I gave them one representative because there were so many of them in Mosul. It was one of the real sources of leadership for the Iraqi military, which had been the one institution that was generally respected by the people, and which tragically our coalition provisional authority had fired on the first day he was there without telling them how we were going to enable them to provide for themselves and their families, after which, of course, he fired the Ba'ath Party all the way down to the level of the bureaucrats we needed to help run a country we didn't sufficiently understand without an agreed reconciliation process. So there's no way they could actually ever serve again. And I was allowed to run a reconciliation process in Mosul, the only one. And that's why it went so much better for so long there. But we actually created a provincial council that was representative of all the people, all the elements of Nainiwa province, with one exception. We had no women initially. We eventually were able to persuade them to do that. And then it was intended, because of the proportionality that we had, that it would ensure not just majority rule, but also minority rights. These are pretty big ideas. And they are, again, values of democratic governance. And in fact, Iraq has been moderately democratically governed ever since, all the way at the national level. They have actually replaced prime ministers and governments, the parliamentary elections. That doesn't mean they've not been without enormous friction, that it didn't. One case, I think it took an entire year of wrangling to actually agree on who the prime minister would be. But there has been peaceful, certainly lots of demonstrations and lots of noise and fractious debate and everything else. But they have actually carried out this democratically elected. Now, some will argue, as Bernard Lewis, the great Princeton professor and Mideast expert, that democracy is strong medicine in the Middle East and in other places as well, and it should be administered small doses at a time. And I might tend to agree with that. And you could hold out certain countries in the Middle East, particularly in some of the Gulf states, where there is rule by essentially kings and emirs and so on, and it has been quite successful. So again, without arguing again comparative politics and how those function so impressively, think of the UAE in particular, certainly Qatar, all of them really, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. But in this case, again, that was what we sought to achieve. And again, especially until the reconciliation process we'd carried out was nullified by those in Baghdad that didn't want to see this kind of progress. It went very well. We literally did investment banking deals. There were 2 hotels that had been looted in the wake of the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime. And we brought in investors from the outside, and they actually bid on, I think, one generated, I don't know, $15 million, et cetera. We had truck stops. We reopened the border with Syria to bring in goods and services and so forth from there. Before we actually paid the government salaries, we found money for that, because if we had just increased the amount of money in a closed economy, of course, it just would have bid up prices. And so therefore my economic, we had to get more goods into the marketplace. We're going to have more money. We need more goods. And I actually predicted to the skeptical members of the provincial council that if we reopened the border with Syria and flooded, we would actually see greater competition. Prices would actually go down, not up, even though there was more money in this economy now as we paid the government servants, which is basically everyone, by the way. There's very little free enterprise other than these individuals in the markets. And that you would also see a better selection. You'd see better quality begin to emerge because there was real competition among those that were putting forth these different goods. And it actually worked out.
Unfortunately, in the democratic world, we're seeing democracy, free values, etc., actually polling less and less favorably. 48% in Poland, mid-50s in France and Spain, about the same in the UK. And what do you have to say to young people who are losing faith in these systems?
That they should keep pressure on those that have been elected to, in a sense, redeem the concepts that underpin free market economies and democratically elected leadership, which in some cases have indeed not performed the way that those entering the workforce would like to see it happen. And I think in the case of the EU in particular, we have a very good diagnosis. Mario Draghi laid this out. There's been insufficient investment in the support of innovation, entrepreneurship, the incentives for it. There's a recognition that the EU is not a single market. It's many different countries speaking many different languages with many different rules and regulations, even under the cumbersome EU rules and regulations, which need to be streamlined and so forth. And the EU Commission has recognized this as well, as has the Parliament. So I think the young people need to keep the pressure on to make our country, our European Union, more competitive than it is, and not to allow the US to run circles around it. It's often said that the EU is the largest market in the world. And I think arguably you can make a case for that. It was a little bit easier when the UK was still part of it, larger in aggregate than the United States. The problem is that it's not in aggregate. And I can tell you, as someone who invests not just as a partner at KKR with these big investments that we make, but actually it's very apparent with the smaller investments in our growth tech. When they try to enter the quote EU, they realize they don't enter the EU. They enter Germany, France, again, other individual countries with their languages and again, their specific limits and so forth. It is not like the 330 plus million people of the United States, which is really one market, and even broader than that, as long as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement remains in force, truly one market. There are obviously strains on that as a result of some of the potential and existing tariffs. So I think, again, put the pressure on your governments. Tell them to read more carefully what Draghi said. You've seen this already happen in Germany, where the restrictive fiscal policies have held Germany back in this area, but also, by the way, of course, in what it was able to spend on defense. And the third largest economy in the world, which is Germany, having surpassed Japan, was only able to spend 1.5% of GDP on defense, despite having been one of the many NATO countries that all agreed to the 2% of GDP back at the Wales summit. Now they're actually going to lead Europe in this regard because they have reduced some of those restrictions. Obviously, you have to be careful, not get out of balance fiscally. The U.S. is obviously in some difficult circumstances in that regard. But again, I think in theory, there's no way that anything can compete with free market economics and democratically elected governance, except if there are imperfections in how that is done. By the way, the U.S. is facing has to come to grips with a number of imperfections because of party primaries, gerrymandering of the districts, which renders, the House of Representatives used to be like this. In other words, there's a Democratic Party, there's a Republican Party, and there was a lot in the middle. You had blue dog Democrats, Eastern Republicans,
rhinos.
etc. And you had districts that would go back and forth. And that has gone like this because partisan politics, the primaries pull you further and further. And the more gerrymandered they are, the more bright red or bright blue they are, the more that we've unleashed money in a way that never was the case before the legal case of Citizens United. We have news channels that are very much aligned with one party or the other, and then social media is even more so. So there's a lot of issues with which the United States itself needs to grapple, and our young people should be doing the same as those elsewhere in pushing government to address the imperfections of the governments, their policies, and the economic system.
And thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.
Can I actually just here, of course, quote my favorite political philosopher, Winston Churchill, who is the source of so many very, very wonderful and witty, but also spot on quotes. And in this case, of course, he famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. He also was fond of saying that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after trying all the other things. And I hope that one still proves true as well. And I'm actually confident that it will, because I'm a huge believer in the system in the United States, in the entrepreneurship, the innovation, the incentives for this, the ecosystems that support that, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you have a message to send to the dictators, authoritarians of the world, and those who support them?
Repent, resign. No, I mean, I'm not sure that they would be receptive for a message from an old soldier turned spy master. They have their confidence. They have surrounded themselves in most cases with individuals that are essentially echo chambers that don't tell the emperor he is ill-clothed that day or what have you. And I think it's very, very difficult to get through. And Gorbachev was the absolute outlier in that regard.
General Petraeus, thank you very much for coming on to Why We Fight. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Sure. And again, do remember that why soldiers really fight is for the soldier on their right and left. But then if you ask them, why did they volunteer? That's really, is the bigger question. They volunteered because their country was fighting for its very survival. It had been attacked, as was the case in the wars of the post 9/11 period. And it was ironic. To some people, it was inexplicable that during the surge in Iraq, actually it was right at the end of it, at the 18-month mark, we conducted the largest re-enlistment ceremony, we believe, in U.S. military history. It was 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines on the 4th of July, 2008. I was the re-enlistment officer. They were reciting the oath after me. And this is really more relevant to what you're talking about. Why are they re-enlisting? Why do you enlist? And that's where it is, because we are serving a mission larger than self. We feel privileged to do so with others who feel the same way. And the American people seem to be really appreciative of our service. Thank you for your service, even if they disagree with the policies that we are executing. And that's the stuff that's tied up more about, again, the values, the American flag, what it stands for, the freedoms that we have fought for over many generations, starting obviously in the Revolutionary War and the period that followed.
Scrap over taxes.
Okay. Good to see you.
Good to see you. That's it for this episode of Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight. What struck you most about their story? What surprised you? What did you disagree with? Feel free to let us know in the comments below and we can have a conversation. But if you enjoyed this work, if you made it to the end, then, well, I hope that you did. Please do like, share, and subscribe. With your help, we can grow this channel and we can get these voices out to more and more people. If you want to support my kind of work financially, then paid subscribers to Patreon or Substack get these episodes 1 week early. Again, that's on all podcast networks and on this YouTube channel. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and always remember, democracy is non-negotiable. Goodbye.